The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to the Women in Depth podcast. Today, I am very excited to welcome Tina Gilbertson. Tina is a psychotherapist and the author of Reconnecting with Your Estranged Adult Child. Her work has been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, Glamour, Real Simple, and Redbook. In 2019, Tina co-founded the ReconnectionClub.com, where she offers education, community, and support to help estranged parents repair their relationships with their adult children. Originally from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, she now lives in Denver, Colorado. Hi, Tina, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Lourdes. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you for being here, for writing your book. I was so excited when I saw the title. And as soon as I got the copy of the book, I just jumped right in. And I was so grateful that you had created this quality, comprehensive resource and guide for parents who are wanting to heal this rift that has come into being between themselves and their adult child. And so I just have to tell you, thank you.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. And it is a privilege to do this work. And I really saw the need for resources specifically for parents, because I think on the adult children side, they do tend to go to therapy in droves compared to people on the parent side of parent-adult-child estrangement. So historically, there haven't been as many supports, I think, in place for parents. So I'm really privileged to be able to do this kind of work.
And how were you drawn to this work?
It really started very much by accident. I found that there were lots of people in my therapy practice who would talk about their relationships with their parents in really discouraging terms. They didn't want to go home for the holidays. They didn't return their parents' calls. And what I learned from talking with these folks was that in a lot of cases, they felt like they couldn't talk to their parents about what the problems were, or that their parents wouldn't understand. And so I had all this information about what adult children were going through and what was causing them to create distance. And I knew that their parents were probably hurting, but they didn't have the same information that I was getting. And so I started to write little articles about, what you can do when someone isn't talking to you and so forth. And I started hearing from parents, dozens and dozens of parents wanting more information. And that's when I realized that this was a thing. This was not just a rare occurrence, that there were lots and lots of people hurting out there who needed information in order to make repairs. So I just got drawn in. I felt pulled into the work because of the great compassion that I have for people on both sides of the parent-child divide when there is a divide. So I really couldn't look away. I couldn't not continue to do work with people on the parent side.
I think that really was very intuitive of you and very aware to pick up on, now that you describe it, it's glaringly obvious that, number one, there's not a lot of resources. There's not even a lot of discussion around how to support the parent in this estrangement situation. And then definitely not a lot of resources. And even if the adult children are in therapy and getting good quality support, healing is limited if you're only addressing one half of the relationship.
Right, exactly. And parents have so much power to set the tone of that relationship. Because if you think about it, as soon as the child was born or came into the parent's life, the parent was the only adult and was the person setting the tone in that two-person relationship. And for the first 18 years of the child's life, the parent had complete power and responsibility in that child's life. And that doesn't just go away as soon as the child turns 18. I think that parents continue to have a huge amount of influence on the tone of that relationship throughout the lifetime. So if they are not using that influence effectively, that's a terrible waste, I think.
I think that's so interesting because I would guess, just based on, the parents who I've worked with who find themselves in this situation, that they would be very surprised to hear it reframed in terms of how much power they have. Because often what I hear is they feel like there's nothing they can do.
You're so right. I find that as well, that they're surprised at the idea that they have any power because on the face of it, they are pretty powerless. If the adult child decides, I'm not going to call you back, I'm not going to get together with you, you cannot see your grandchildren, that seems pretty powerful if you are the rejected parent. So it is easy to lose sight of the fact that as a parent, you have inherent power and influence inside that relationship. What you do in response to estrangement very much matters and can make the difference between a prolonged estrangement and a healed one.
What does it mean to be estranged from your adult child?
That is something of an open question, but we could cover a fair amount of ground. Depending on who you talk to, some researchers will say that if you haven't had contact of any kind within a certain period, say a year or something like that, they would define you as estranged if you haven't had contact with a family member for a particular period. But that's a quantitative view of estrangement. I think of it as physical and or emotional distance from someone you used to be closer to or want to feel close to. There's different ways that estrangement can manifest, and I mention these in my book. There's total cutoff, where there is simply no contact. You cannot get a response. And this goes on over some long period of time. I think 100 years ago, if somebody wanted to cut off their parents and walk away forever, that was a lot more doable 100 years ago, before the internet, before telephones. It was hard if someone left your town and moved away into the big wide world. They might stay away forever. Nowadays, that's much, much harder to do. We're so much more connected. But anyway, there can be something akin to total cutoff. But that's not the only type of estrangement out there. I think the most common way we see this is with an on-again, off-again, or periodic, or cyclical kind of relationship where sometimes we're talking and sometimes we're not. Sometimes a relationship feels okay and sometimes it feels troubled for me or for both of us, let's say. And so that on again, off again type may be the most common type, and there are reasons for that. But there's also a third type that I think of as emotional estrangement, where there may be regular contact, frequent contact even, and maybe it's even civil. Maybe you go for coffee, maybe you go for lunch, but it feels like the person is like a stranger. You're not comfortable. Maybe you feel like you're walking on eggshells. It just doesn't feel right. And I think of that as an emotional kind of estrangement. So it looks different ways for different people, but I think in essence, you feel a distance between yourself and someone you love.
Now, Tina, would you consider estrangement as the appropriate, description if the parent and the adult child never really had a close, loving relationship? Or is estrangement more accurate for those who have had some closeness or some type of loving, warm relationship?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think there are relationships that were never as close as one or both people wanted it to be. I do think of that as estranged, and maybe it's been estranged the whole time. And maybe there's something there that could change, could be healed, could evolve in a direction that feels better for one or both, that feels closer. So I think the answer is you don't have to have been close before, but with family relationships, there's very often a concern about, gee, we have never really been close, or gee, we're not close anymore. There's a concern about closeness because there is this family relationship in which you're, quote unquote, supposed to be close.
And I think, too, that along with the idea that we're supposed to be close, then there's also familial, societal pressures about how a parent and adult child should be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I hear a lot from parents who say, my friends' kids behave very differently. My friends' kids always send cards and send gifts on my friends' birthdays, and they always come home for the holidays, and they have such a close relationship. They do this together, they do that together. So they compare themselves to other parents. And you can always find a parent with a good relationship with their child. They're not hard to find. But I think what is harder to spot is the troubled relationship. That may be more common than we think. But you're right, there is this general societal assumption that families are close, and that if you're not, there's something wrong with you if your child isn't wanting to be close. So there is a lot of pressure, both on the adult child, I would say, and on the parent. The parent, I think, is more stigmatized or feels more stigmatized, even though adult children will also tell you that they feel stigmatized because they get pressure to forgive and to reunite. So there's a lot of pressure on both sides because of this, what you're talking about with our society, this valuing of family bonds.
One of the things that really just stands out for me, as we started our interview, and it's just very clear in your writing and right now how you just have so much compassion for the parents in this situation, which I think is different. It's refreshing. It's needed. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Lourdes. I think you're right. It is needed. There is so much polarization around this topic. It's obviously a highly emotional topic, and there's a lot of us versus them. Mm-hmm. Parents call their children selfish, narcissistic, bratty, materialistic, whatever. Children call their parents the same things. So there's a lot of mudslinging. And I have found that there is an assumption if there's a rift in the parent-adult-child relationship. There is an assumption, well, the parent must be a difficult person if the child doesn't get along with their own parent. So there is that very much a stigma, and I feel a lack of compassion for the people in the parents' shoes. And for me, it's very easy to find that compassion when I remember that the parent is also somebody's child, and that parenting and parent-adult-child relationships take place serially over time, over generations and generations of families. And so no one is uniquely making mistakes. There are patterns in families that get passed down, and everyone pretty much does the best that we know how to do with the tools that we're given. And when you assume that someone has done the very best that they can, and maybe better than their parents did by them, it's much harder to be judgmental of those people.
So, Tina, how does estrangement happen? I guess what contributes to it?
Well, the research has found a lot of different contributing factors, but what it does seem to boil down to, and this comes up again and again and again, is the adult child feels in some way hurt or disappointed or invisible or distressed, rejected, abandoned, neglected. They feel hurt in the relationship. Maybe they've tried to fit themselves into the relationship anyway, even though they feel pain within it. Estrangement is usually a last-ditch effort to protect the self. And so what it comes down to is perhaps, if you wanted to try to put it in a nutshell, maybe not feeling loved in a way that the child can hear. And that devastates parents to think of because they feel that they love their children. And the idea that the child doesn't feel that love is really, really distressing for the parent who doesn't know. I mean, what do you do with that when you love somebody and they don't feel that love from you. That's a tough one.
Yeah, that's powerful. I can see also how that can lead to the feelings of powerlessness with a parent, right?
Right. It's like, I love you so much, and you don't get that. I don't know, what can I do? I feel like I've been loving you all your life, and now you tell me you don't feel loved. And of course, not everybody puts their reasons for estrangement in those words, but I'm kind of putting it in a nutshell like that. Now you're telling me there's something wrong between us, and you're cutting me off. There's no discussion. I don't get a chance to have a back and forth with you about this. That is where the powerlessness comes from. It's very easy to understand why parents feel powerless.
I found it interesting in your book that you noted that many adult children, or most, feel like they have communicated to their parent why they are upset with them or what they are hurt or angry about. And there are a majority, it seems like most parents who are estranged from their adult child feel like they don't know the reason and are very confused about it. And I found that very interesting.
I did too. And I got that information from a website that did an informal online survey of people on both sides. And I think it's possible that both are telling the truth, that the adult children do feel like they gave plenty of warning, but the warnings that they gave, or the way that they talked about their needs or their disappointments, did not get through. And if you think about it, estrangement is a problem of communication. One of the foremost researchers in the field, Christina Sharp, is a professor of communications, because estrangement is a communication problem, essentially. And it may be that there was simply a breakdown where, yes, the parent heard all of the words that the child said, or maybe they noticed all of the child's behavior, but they did not interpret that as, this is really serious, something needs to change, or there's going to be a breach here. And actually, Christina Sharp, that same researcher, coined the term relational moral hazard to describe this risk of that happens in families where, if you and I are related, I feel like I can pretty much just let my hair down with you, and I can maybe cross the line a few times unwittingly with you, and you won't cut me off because you're family, right? I mean, we're stuck together. So if I get it wrong, sometimes you're going to forgive me, just as I forgive you for not being perfect. And a lot of parents, many parents I talk to, are absolutely shocked that they ended up where they did, because they never in a million years thought that there could be a breach between themselves and their children. We all kind of, in this society, somewhat take for granted the strength of family bonds. It's just part of how we think about family.
That makes so much sense. You just don't realize or ever consider that there could be a bottom, right? There could be a final boundary or line to cross.
Right. And it's also complicated by the fact that many parents put up with quite a lot from their own parents for many, many years. That is the model they're working from. Yes, your mother isn't perfect, or your dad has an anger problem, but you accept them anyway because they're your parents. So if they've been doing that for decades, and now their 28-year-old is not prepared to do that for them, they bump up against something intergenerational there, an expectation they didn't realize that they were living with. I put up with my parents. Why on earth can't you put up with me? I'm not as bad to you as my parents were to me. So how is this fair?
Yeah, one of the lines that I highlighted when I was reading your book, which goes with what you're saying right now, is, no matter how sudden or abrupt it might seem, estrangement usually has causes that reach back in time.
Yes, I have never heard of an estrangement that sprang out of nowhere, where there was a basically good relationship between the parent and child. The parent did one thing, and that was beyond the pale, and the child decided, you know what? I'm not going to talk to you anymore because you did that. The stage is set. So even though there's often a final, what Christina Sharp calls the straw that broke the camel's back, that's what it is. It's the last straw. It's not the incident that your child is holding a grudge about. There is a lot more water that's gone under the bridge, to mix metaphors around here before that straw is placed.
Well, I think too, one of I'm not phrasing it as well as you did in the book, but I'm paraphrasing where you stated that for many adult children, it's actually less painful to be estranged than to not be estranged. So that's like the viable option, that to be close to you hurts. And so even though it hurts to be distant, that's less painful than being close to you.
Yeah, and what an awful thing to think if you are the parent, to think that, my child, although it's hard to be estranged, especially in a society that values family bonds, it's even harder for my child to be close. You can imagine how that affects your self-image and your feelings about yourself, your family, your child. But it is true that the child at some point feels the need to make a decision, a choice between one evil and another. And sometimes the choice is between hurting myself or hurting my parent, because the parent wants to be close, but it hurts me to be close. So for a long while, maybe I am close to the parent because that's important to the parent. But over time, I get worn down because I feel hurt or something in the relationship. And so eventually I choose me. I choose the pain of estrangement over the pain of being in that relationship. And there are ways that people can get hurt in relationships that happen regardless of whether the parent wants to. In fact, I think most of the pain in relationships between people who are, let's say, not sociopathic happens as sort of collateral damage. I don't know too many people who want to hurt their children or want to hurt their spouse just by being in the relationship a certain way. I don't know a lot of people who are setting out to hurt the people closest to them. So it is sort of more like a collateral damage thing. When I protect me, that may hurt you, if protecting me means removing myself.
Tina, one of the chapters in your book, which I felt was, well, actually, the whole book was amazing. So it's really, I can't really say one really stood out. All of it is so helpful and so informative for the reader. But the one that I want to focus on right now is where you talk about unmet needs, which are also shared needs. And then you bring up this concept of the child parent, which I think is really, really powerful for understanding estrangement. So could you talk a little bit about the significance of looking at these needs when you're looking at estrangement between an adult child and a parent?
Yeah, the idea is that we all have needs, and we come into the world with these needs, and some of them are physical, food and water and so forth, and others are emotional needs, the need to be seen for who we are as people, the need for basic belonging, some valuing, some affection. We need to feel that we matter to important other people, not because we're so great, but just that we have basic human dignity and we're important to our family. So we have these emotional needs, and we don't really outgrow those. Those are pretty much universal human needs. And particularly there are many, many ways that those needs don't get met. Parents are human. Parents are busy. Parents have jobs and tasks and other things on their minds. And so it's absolutely impossible to meet your children's needs 100% of the time. I call it filling the bucket, filling the emotional bucket. You're lucky if you get that right, 60% of the time as you go about your life. So most of us don't get our needs perfectly met when we're children, and we grow up with a sort of a semi-empty bucket. And then we're expected to kind of pay it forward and take what's in our buckets and meet the needs of the children who come after us. And that is asking a lot, because in some ways, we're still waiting for those needs to get met. We're still waiting for what was due to us as children. And it's really, really hard to then be required to fill someone else's bucket. So in a sense, you've got one foot in the parent role, but the other foot is still waiting in some sense for those needs that started in childhood to be met. And as adults, we do, as I said, these continue throughout the lifetime. We do still seek to get our needs met. We typically seek to get them met from peers like our spouse, our friends, siblings, even our own parents later in life. We still have the needs, we still seek to get them met. So in that sense, we are coming sort of from the place of the child with the bucket waiting to be filled. And yet, in many cases, we're also now someone else's parent. It's a pretty hard balance to strike.
Yeah, and I think that maybe also for adult children, at least this is what I see in my practice, is if that adult child is doing their best to work on themselves and to learn, and they are also a parent, I often see a window for reconnection and healing once that child begins to become a child parent themselves.
Yeah, and I think the key to that is really finding self-compassion. When you can really step into being there for yourself and kind of parenting yourself, it becomes much, much easier to parent someone else, to have compassion for someone else, even when they're being unreasonable or difficult or having feelings that are inconvenient. Self-compassion really enables us to accept not only ourselves, but other people more easily. And I think a lot of people see that as a platitude, love yourself before you can love others. And they don't really think about how profoundly true that is and how it is not optional to have compassion for yourself if you want to really be there for someone else. You must have self-compassion.
Yeah, it's necessary. It's an integral part of being in loving, healthy relationship with others.
Right.
So, Tina, one of the chapters that you also include in your book has to do with contact. And I think this is such a big topic when it comes to estrangement.
It's
often I
huge.
see this as something that brings clients to therapy, actually, is that there's some kind of issue. It's usually no contact or no contact with grandchildren or minimal contact or hostile contact. But it seems like this is, for many, what really grabs their attention.
It is. And what's tricky to really get across is that contact is not the solution. The problem is that there is not sufficient contact or there's not effective or warm contact. So when the problem is the nature of contact, the solution is not contact. The solution is to stop trying to push something that isn't working. Sometimes I'll hear from parents, I reached out to my child. It's been 18 months and I sent a birthday card. I sent holiday cards. When should I try again? And if contact has not been solving the problem, contact apparently is not the solution. The solution is to educate yourself about what are the issues that led to the lack of contact or the unsatisfying contact or the vitriolic contact. What are those issues? What is required of me to address those issues? So it seems that contact is the first place that parents want to go. How do I do it in such a way that it's successful? What words do I use to really convey the depth of my remorse or my whatever it is? But that is premature if you haven't. That's why I wrote a book about reconnecting, and contact is one chapter in it. The whole book isn't about contact because there's so much else to work through before any kind of contact can be successful.
You just reminded me of a quote that I highlighted when I was reading your book, and I actually shared it with my husband. It was just really like, wow, that's powerful. And you say, as long as the factors that led your child to create distance remain in place, he or she will not be able to settle into an easy, relaxed, loving, and close relationship with you. And I think that just speaks to what you're saying about it's not the contact that's the problem. And you need to look at what were the factors that led to the estrangement. You have to go back to the root, to the beginning.
Exactly. Right. And that is assuming that there is a relational problem there beyond a phase of development where the child just simply needs more room to grow, to be autonomous, to experience independence, and so on. I mean, sometimes the greatest problem is not a troubled relationship or is not feeling disrespected or anything like that. Sometimes the problem is the child just really needs more room, a little bit more breathing space. Maybe the family has been super duper close. There has been an unspoken expectation that we will always talk several times a week or every day or something like that. And the child wants to experience life with a little bit more separation. And sometimes that is largely or entirely the problem.
And I really am glad that you brought that up. And I think that that is another, such an important part of this book, another piece that has to be considered, that this is a normal psychological developmental process, and your child needs to separate as part of their individuation, as part of their growth. And the parent's job is to let go.
Right. Estrangement isn't normal, but it is a reaction to a normal phase of development if that phase gets thwarted somehow.
And you know what, Tina, I think that this whole section that you have on this normal, developmental process of individuation and healthy separation, I felt like there was so much information there. You could do a whole other book for parents who are having to let go of their adult children. I really thought that when I read that.
Thank you. It's so funny how this is something that all of us have to go through, right? As we grow up, we need to figure out who we are as adults, and we need to separate to some degree from family and individualize. And yet it can come as such a surprise, because I guess we get into these just ways of being together that there's a status quo there. And along comes a developmental phase that upsets that. And it's like, oh, where did that come from?
What I loved especially about this chapter that you wrote is I felt like, there are a lot of books and websites and blogs on empty nesters and when your children leave home. However, I felt that the way you described it in your chapter was something more of a milestone that every parent experiences, just as children have this milestone of leaving home and going out into the world, but it's never really looked at as a milestone for parents. It almost seems like, well, that's it. That's the end of the parenting experience. Now you need to find a way to fill your life, which I know that that's a part of this also, but I just feel that the way you conceptualized it and described it really captured the nuances much more than the term empty nesting.
Yeah, I guess, I have not really given that much thought, but in nature, I suppose an empty nest means those little baby birds are gone. That is really the end of it. And of course, that's devastating.
It is,
to think that this child you love is now, that's it. You loved them for 18, 21, 40 years, whatever. And now you had your chance with them. And that is the biggest fear that I run into with parents is, if I don't fix this today, my child is going to move further and further and further away until I have lost her completely. And of course, that's going to put you into a panic. But that is not how I conceptualize. If you have a foundation for a good, healthy relationship with your child, that relationship may change, but it can still be good and it can still be healthy. And it may have to pick up on the other side of a little bit of a hiatus while your child goes off and does her thing.
Now, your book, we could just talk for hours. There's so many parts of it that I would love to just talk with you about. But I just want to mention for our listeners that, while Tina and I have described, some of the ways that estrangement can happen, and we're looking at estrangement through certain lenses, Tina also mentions special circumstances, parental alienation, when someone has turned your child against you, if you suspect mental illness in your child, sibling rivalry, and many other circumstances that can result or lead to estrangement from your adult child. And I really encourage you, if you find yourself in a situation like this where you feel that you are estranged from your adult child to pick up this book. And I truly believe that there's something in it for everyone, even though we're not able to touch on all of those at this time. I wanted to mention that. And for our listeners now, I wanted to touch on the topic of how do you deal with a child who has gone no contact on you or has said, don't contact me? What are the do's and don'ts for a parent?
Well, I mean, the first thing you want to do is don't panic. This does happen. It does not mean that this is going to be forever, especially if your child is like 21 years old. And whatever needs to be repaired in the relationship does not need to be repaired right this second. So the first thing is don't panic, because whatever you do in a panic out of desperation is not going to be strategic. It may not be effective, and it may not serve the needs of your child. And that's important. That's an important thing to think about, is how do I serve the needs of this child who is indicating that things are not right between us? The second thing I would do is, and it goes along with not panicking, is to sit with your own feelings. Realize if you're having a panicky feeling, if you're feeling desperate, if you're feeling abandoned, just sit with those feelings, because those need to be honored and worked through. And you don't do that by taking action. You don't work through feelings by taking action. You work through feelings by sitting and paying attention to them and allowing yourself to have them. Too often we take action as a kind of palliative, as a painkiller, to try and get rid of these feelings like desperation and fear that we don't want to have. So learning to tolerate the feelings that are inside of you is not optional when your child goes no contact. You have got to be able to sit with your feelings, because sometimes reaching out is going to just push your child further away. And I see this happen all the time. The parent cannot help but reach out, even when the child has been downright hostile in his response to that and said, just leave me alone. Give me some time. I will get back to you. And the parent finds it impossible not to do that, because the feelings inside the parent are just demanding action. So those are the preliminaries. Then you want to, once you've kind of got a handle on yourself, you want to try understanding. How did this happen? What may be going on here? And this is difficult because defenses may come up. The last thing we want to do is look at ways in which we have let somebody down, especially somebody we care about. So sometimes defensiveness can get in the way of understanding. You may think, well, my child is just, and then you may just describe your child as someone who cuts off relationships. That may be true, that your child is someone who cuts people off, but the more productive thing is to think, why did she cut me off? What happened between us? Okay, so understanding is as best you possibly can, putting together pieces from what you know. What did your child complain about once upon a time? What is the theme of your child's complaints or disappointments or conversations that you've had with your child? What are the themes that keep coming up? Because you want to have some understanding under your belt before you get to the final thing that you might do if your child goes no contact, which is to reach out to your child. If your child has issued a no contact request, and that may come in many different forms, they may say, please don't contact me. If they do, you're lucky, because that's a very clear message. But they may just say, I'd like us not to talk so often, or I need some time to work on myself, or, that there are many, many ways in which they indicate that they want less contact. And what I generally recommend is just to write a very short acknowledgement of that no contact request. I got your email, I got your text or whatever. I'm sorry that it has been necessary for you to take a step back in time. I'd like to see if I can address the issues, but I'm just writing to say I got your request and I will respect it. I will respect it. And in most cases, not all, but I think in most cases, the right thing to do is to try to respect that request. because you can't necessarily shorten the time that your child needs apart, but you can sure prolong it by refusing to give them the space that they are asking for. And in the case, just very quickly, I'm not any kind of an expert on parental alienation syndrome, but if your child has clearly been alienated from you to the point where your good relationship with your child has been completely turned around and your child is being cruel and showing absolutely no remorse in cutting you off, and they're quite young and they are clearly under the influence of someone who's alienating them from you, then it may be that some part of your child wants you to continue reaching out. And it is only in that case, the case of parental alienation, or in the case where your child has complained of neglect, you don't care about me, you never pay attention to me or whatever. In those cases, you may want to disregard a no contact request. But those cases are not the majority. So for most parents, as a general rule, respecting the no contact request is the right thing to do.
Now, Tina, what about if parental alienation happened when the children were younger and now the children are adults? How can a estranged parent begin to approach this?
I think that the people who are experts on this, I'm just going to take a guess, might say that you gently continue reaching out, letting the child know that you are there for them, that you're interested in having a relationship, that you understand if they're not ready for that, but that you are always there for them. And that if it's okay with them, you will try to reach out again in 6 months.
It's so helpful, Tina. You really, I know that this book, your resources are really going to, make such a difference in so many lives.
I hope so. I really do.
If someone is listening and they'd like to work with you, find out more about your work, buy your book, where's the best place that they can find you?
Thank you for asking. I think the best, most central place to find me is on my website, tinagilbertson.com. And you can read about the book, you can read about the Reconnection Club, and you can read about my personal services there.
Tina, again, thank you so much for writing this incredible, compassionate, just chock full of support, insights, practical tips that I think that, so many parents will benefit from and potentially, heal so many relationships with their adult children. I'm very excited to share this with the world.
I so appreciate that, Lourdes, and I really appreciate your having me on your show. Thank you so much for the conversation and for your support of the book.
Take care. Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting Women in Depth with a one-time or recurring donation. Any amount is appreciated and helps us continue to provide free, quality content for the world. If donating resonates with you, you can find the donation link on today's show notes. You can also follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.